"Excuse me, the first-class lounge is for premium guests only." The words weren't loud, not rude, but they struck his self-esteem like a silent knife. The man didn't react. No frown, no questions. He just stood still, silent like a stranger trying to understand why he had just been excluded from the very place he had created. No vest, no tie, just a wrinkled shirt, a worn-out backpack, and the eyes of a man of experience. But to the lounge attendant, he wasn't high-class enough to get inside. A few minutes later, another man approached. Younger. A charcoal-colored coat. A gleaming leather bag. No need to show a card. No further questions asked. "Welcome, Mr. Harris. Your favorite whiskey has been prepared." Everything felt like a ritual, and the first man still standing outside, as if unseen by anyone. His name was Daniel Ford, 47 years old. The founder and CEO of Aerolux Air, the company he had built from a single chartered plane into a national brand with 28,000 employees and millions of customers each year. But today, he didn't carry the title of CEO. Today, he was Greg Miller, an anonymous passenger on a 14-day investigative journey across 10 routes throughout the United States. And the most painful part, it wasn't that he was denied entry. It was that this was the 23rd time he had witnessed it happen, and the first time he himself was the victim. Daniel wasn't angry. He just pulled out a small black leather notebook, worn, its paper edges frayed, and added another line to the hundreds of notes already recorded. Denied entry to lounge. No smile, no verification, not a single word of apology. Judged by attire, assumed to be a regular passenger. But this time, he wouldn't just take note and let it go. If you were judged just by the clothes you wear, would you stay silent or stand up? This is not a fictional story. This is the truth. And this time, the owner would not let it slide anymore. 2 weeks earlier, the 38th floor of the Aerolux Air building in downtown Chicago was hazy in the early autumn rain. The sky was a solid gray, and gusts of wind beat against the office's glass walls, as if reminding Daniel Ford of the things that were slowly falling apart within his own company. On his desk was a pile of papers, charts, reports, customer feedback emails, all sharing a common theme: dissatisfaction. Not because of delayed flights or lost luggage, but because of attitude, because of the way employees treated customers, as if they were being silently ranked by the brand of their shoes or their hairstyle. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the stack of reports, his gaze deep and penetrating. The data didn't lie, but it wasn't enough to explain why, and he needed to know why. The door burst open without a knock. Only one person dared to do that. Claire Holloway, 62, Chief Operating Officer, who had co-founded Aerolux with Daniel since their days in a dilapidated hangar in Salt Lake City. You've seen them, haven't you? She placed 2 cups of coffee on the desk. Daniel nodded slightly. I know the downward curve of the satisfaction index by heart. Claire frowned. I don't think the numbers are the problem. I believe it's a feeling. The way people are made to feel they aren't good enough." He was silent for a long moment. The wind howled behind the glass. The gentle scent of hot coffee spread through the air, but Daniel felt a chill in his heart. "Finally," he said softly, as if to himself, "I can't fix it from up here. I have to go down there." Claire looked up, exhaling sharply. "Don't tell me you're going undercover again, Daniel. The last time you inspected the Houston airport, you were almost put on floor mopping duty." Daniel let out a weary laugh. "But I found the flaw in the emergency equipment maintenance procedure." He paused, his eyes gradually becoming resolute. "This time, I'll be Greg Miller, a retired teacher, visiting friends, no corporate account, no privileges, just a middle-class passenger." Claire fell silent. Then she spoke slowly. "If anything becomes unsafe, or if anyone starts to get suspicious, you pull out immediately. You're the CEO, not an investigative reporter." Daniel nodded, but deep in his eyes, he knew this trip wasn't just for investigation. It was to re-examine the conscience of a man who had unintentionally built a system that categorized people by their appearance. That evening, Daniel walked into a budget store in the suburbs. He picked out a few unbranded shirts, a worn leather backpack, and a pair of cheap reading glasses. In the mirror, he saw himself, unshaven, slightly messy hair, unironed jeans, the sleepy face of a man with nothing left to prove. And that was the perfect look. Because starting tomorrow, he was no longer Daniel Ford. He was Greg Miller, the man who would go searching for the cracks in the service culture of his own creation. The first day as Greg Miller began at O'Hare Airport, a destination Daniel had flown to hundreds of times as CEO. But today, he sat on a hard plastic chair in the public area, holding a paper cup of coffee, silently observing the world operating around him, a world where he was no longer the center. The old backpack beside him looked unremarkable. So did the clothes he was wearing: a light blue shirt, a khaki jacket, jeans, and faded sneakers. No one paid any attention to him, and that was what Daniel wanted. On his journey from Chicago to Denver, and then from Denver to Seattle, he began to see it. It wasn't obvious, not rude, but it was clearly there. An elderly woman, neatly dressed but pulling a worn-out suitcase. She had to lift her own luggage into the overhead bin, struggling while 3 flight attendants walked past without noticing. But just a few minutes later, a man in a suit boarded. Before he could even reach up, a flight attendant was there at once. "Let me help you with that, sir." Daniel tilted his head, taking a note. No offensive words. No one yelled at anyone. But who got help and who was ignored was perfectly clear. At another airport, he saw a young couple in hoodies, holding premium economy tickets. They were waiting for an upgrade but were denied because the list is already locked. But just 10 minutes later, a man in a cashmere coat, not on the list, was invited to the first-class cabin. "Hello, sir. It's a pleasure to have you with us." He noted the time, the gait, the dialogue, the employee's expression. It wasn't one person. It wasn't one place. It was a chain of repeated behaviors, as if only those who looked wealthy deserved preferential treatment. Daniel began to understand modern discrimination doesn't need slurs. It just needs a judgmental head-to-toe glance, a selective smile, an unexplained priority. And then, on a flight from Boston to Dallas, Daniel encountered something that made him catch his breath for a moment. A little boy, about 8 years old, traveling with his father, was wearing a cartoon hoodie. When the boy's father asked a flight attendant if they could switch to a seat near the window, the attendant refused immediately. The seats are fixed in the system, but just 5 minutes later, the person sitting next to Daniel, a young white man in a blazer, was invited to change seats with a gentle voice. "We want your flight to be as comfortable as possible." Daniel remained silent, a familiar feeling rising in his chest. Not anger, but shame. Shame because he once thought satisfaction metrics were enough to understand his customers. Now, he realized beneath those statistics were countless people who were forgotten simply because they didn't have the right look in someone's eyes. A small emotional twist concludes the scene. On his way out of the plane, Daniel happened to overhear a young flight attendant whisper to her colleague, "The old man in seat 19C looked pretty rough, but he was very polite." The other one laughed. "Well, he doesn't look like a premium passenger, but who knows?" Daniel suddenly realized he was the one sitting in seat 19C. Day 10 of the journey. Atlanta's airport was packed, the sound of announcements echoing from the high ceiling, making the whole area feel like a distorted speaker. Daniel, in his role as Greg Miller, was in no hurry. He walked slowly, like someone more accustomed to silent observation than to pushing through crowds. Ticket in hand, he headed towards the first-class lounge area, a place his diamond membership card allowed him to enter at any time. But this time, things were not like in previous years. The woman at the counter, her name tag read Sarah Jennings, didn't smile, nor did she greet him. Her eyes swept over his rumpled shirt and old backpack, then immediately frowned very slightly, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for Daniel to realize he had just been classified in her mind. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, her voice professional but cold. "This lounge is for first-class passengers and diamond members." Daniel presented his card. "I'm a diamond member." Sarah glanced at the card without even trying to look it up. She took a step back, tapping on a computer screen whose interface Daniel knew well because he himself had approved it. But instead of verifying, she narrowed her eyes and looked him up and down once more. "We need to re-verify your information, sir," Sarah said, her voice lower. "Could you please wait outside for a moment?" Daniel stood still. No protest, no questions, just a quiet nod. Stepping back from the frosted glass area where he had once signed off on millions of dollars for its interior construction, the door closed behind him. He sat down on a row of plastic chairs in the public waiting area. No cushions, no free coffee, nothing. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out the black notebook, turned to a new page, and wrote, "Denied entry to lounge despite having a diamond card. System not checked. Name not asked. Judged solely on appearance." For the first time, I was the one being judged. In front of him, a young man had just entered the lounge. An expensive blazer, a designer leather briefcase. No one asked him for verification. No one checked his number. "Welcome, Mr.
Harris,"
Sarah beamed.
"your favorite whiskey is ready."
Daniel looked through the frosted glass. He couldn't see their faces clearly, but the attitude was all too obvious. He wasn't angry. He just felt something slowly cracking inside his chest, not because he was offended, but because the system he had once believed to be fair turned out to operate on feelings, and those feelings were controlled by handbags, watches, and the color of a coat. The first major twist: this was no longer individual behavior. This was a covert classification model, not written in any training manual, not recorded in any policy, but it existed in the smiles, the glances, and the invisible distance between two differently dressed people. Daniel closed his notebook, leaning back against the hard plastic chair. An employee had just pulled the glass door open, inviting another young man into the lounge. No card needed, no proof required, just looking like someone important. For the first time in 10 days, Daniel felt he was no longer investigating his company. He was investigating himself. Daniel remained seated there, in the public waiting area next to the lounge. In one hand, he held a now cold cup of coffee. With the other, he flipped through the pages of the small notebook, now thick with writing. The notes from Boston, Chicago, Denver. Each city brought a different slice of the same painful reality. Service was distributed based on a perception of visible worth. Just as he finished writing the last line, Diamond guest denied entry without verification. Preferential service based on appearance. A gentle voice spoke beside him. "They did the same thing to me last month." Daniel looked up. Beside him was a man in his late 50s, with neatly cut salt and pepper hair, a tall, slender frame, wearing a faded windbreaker and sneakers with worn-out heels. He placed his canvas bag at his feet, leaning back slightly in the chair, as if he was used to not being in the lounge. "Sarah, the woman at the counter, pulls that trick a lot," he said, glancing toward the lounge. "If she thinks you don't belong, then it's over." Daniel blinked. He recognized that tone, not anger, but resignation, like someone used to living in the system's gray area. "Do you fly often?" Daniel asked, still playing the role of Greg Miller. "David Mitchell," the man said, extending his hand for a shake. "Diamond since 2007. I used to be very proud of that. Now, it doesn't mean anything if you don't wear a suit on every flight." Daniel shook his hand lightly. "Greg Miller. Just started flying again recently." David gave a faint smile. "When I was a vice president of sales, everything was smooth. Every time I boarded a plane, it was greetings, upgrades, invitations to the lounge. But since I retired and started consulting, dressing more casually, everything changed." Daniel watched him intently. "And you started noticing those changes?" David nodded, bending down to open his bag and taking out a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a printed sheet with dates, times, flight numbers, and handwritten notes in ballpoint pen. "I don't have time to write a novel," he said with a sad smile. "But I'm a numbers guy. Everything has a common denominator." Daniel took the paper. The notes were almost identical to what he had written in his own notebook, asked for re-verification. Despite being a long-time member, casually dressed passengers often ignored when asking for help. "Have you ever filed a complaint?" Daniel asked. 3 times. David answered curtly. Each time, I received a template response. "We apologize for your experience. Your feedback will be forwarded to the relevant department." But nothing ever changes. "I don't need privileges. I just want to be treated as if my loyalty has value, even when I'm not carrying a leather briefcase or a Swiss watch." That sentence made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. "I just want to be valued, even when I'm not trying to look important." No words could have been sharper. Daniel folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. "I understand what you're saying more than you think." David squinted slightly, looking skeptical, but didn't ask further. He just stared silently toward the gate area, where an employee was smiling warmly while welcoming a male passenger in a suit with a flashy gold watch. When you're no longer flying for meetings, not wearing business attire every day, you see the true face of service. David said, "It's not service. It's a stage. And if you're not dressed for the part, you have no place in the play." An emotional twist concludes the scene. Daniel gently squeezed the paper in his pocket. For the first time, he realized he wasn't the only one keeping a notebook. And if David, a loyal customer for 15 years, also saw this pattern, then this was no longer an intuition. It was a real culture, and it was eroding trust, bit by bit. The flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles departed 10 minutes late. The plane was less crowded than usual, the space quieter, almost ideal conditions for Daniel to think. He chose a seat near the back, by the window, row 24, far enough from first class. Anonymous enough that no one would notice him. The coffee was weak, his notebook nearly full. Daniel slowly added a few more notes from the morning. As the plane was preparing for takeoff, someone slipped into the seat next to him. Daniel glanced up briefly, then quickly turned away. It was her, Diane Walker, the flight attendant from the Denver flight the day before, the one he had witnessed walk past an elderly passenger, only to immediately help a young man in designer shoes in a row behind. Right now, Diane wasn't in uniform. She was off-duty, wearing a hoodie with the airline's logo, skinny jeans, and white sneakers. One hand held her phone, the other wore an earbud, her fingers swiping quickly as if texting someone very familiar. Daniel had no intention of prying, but his eyes involuntarily skimmed across the phone screen, and in a split second, a name appeared that made his heart tighten. Thomas Reed, the newly promoted regional director in charge of the Atlanta, Dallas, and LAX hubs. One of the people whose appointment he had personally signed off on for his ability to optimize operations. And now, he was on the other end of this conversation. Daniel leaned toward the window, trying to stay calm, but the chat messages continued to appear. An old guy was causing trouble at the Atlanta lounge today. Looked like a retired professor, thick glasses, but kept insisting on getting in. Sarah made him wait outside. We flagged him. Daniel held his breath. Did she mean marking a passenger, monitoring them, blocking their access? A minute later, a reply from Thomas appeared. Good. LAX will monitor for similar behavior. Same protocol. Diane texted back, "I've already notified them. Re-verify ID. Random security check if necessary." And then the final message, as cold as an invisible slap. "You know the procedure." She added a thumbs up emoji. Then she put her phone away, leaned her head against the seat, and pulled her scarf up over her eyes as if she had just completed a small task. Daniel didn't move. He didn't react. He just felt a deep-seated anger slowly rising, not a raw, hot anger, but the kind that comes from realization. This was no longer accidental. This was a system. The major twist. What he had thought was a feeling, an unspoken culture, turned out to be secretly programmed, operated through short messages between people who thought no one was watching. Daniel clenched his fists, but his face remained expressionless. If he reacted now, it would all be over. And he wasn't ready for it to be over. Because now, he didn't just have a journal. He had evidence. And for the first time, he understood what he was facing wasn't bad service. It was a network for filtering people by appearance, organized, with someone giving orders, and with people silently carrying them out. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The hotel room overlooked a quiet Los Angeles boulevard, the streetlights reflecting on the desk where he had laid out a maze of documents. On the bed was the nearly full black notebook. On the desk were internal printouts that Claire, on the other end of the line, had just sent from headquarters policies, new operational regulations, system logs from control gates. He read every line. Not a single word was missed. And then, from the middle of the pile of documents, a phrase jumped out at him like a knife twisting in his stomach. Brand-aligned presentation. This very phrase, cold, abstract, had been inserted into documents signed off by Thomas Reed after Aerolux acquired the regional airline Skyspan last year. Reed was promoted to regional director overseeing Atlanta and the West Coast. From then on, a series of changes occurred. Employees were empowered to make on-the-spot priority judgments. The re-verification process became flexible, meaning it was up to the employee to decide when a passenger needed extra screening. The flag list was not visible in the customer profile, but existed covertly in the internal system. Daniel replayed the messages between Diane and Reed in his memory. Re-verify ID if necessary. Same protocol. Flagged. It all matched. He quickly scrolled through the system logs Claire had sent. A series of customer accounts, including his own as Greg Miller, were tagged with an X3 code in their profiles, accompanied by notes. Does not match profile image. Requires re-verification during peak hours. High flight frequency, but appearance is inconsistent. Daniel was almost stunned into silence. This was no longer individual behavior. It was architecture. A system designed to select who deserved preferential treatment, not based on their history, but on their appearance. Sarah, who had blocked him from the lounge. Kevin Rowe, the LAX agent who had faced internal complaints but no disciplinary action. Diane, the flight attendant who communicated directly with Reed using coded language so familiar it was clear she had done it dozens of times. And at the center of it all was Thomas Reed, the architect of the entire visual priority system, disguised under the name of experience optimization. Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking out at the sleeping city. The anger inside him was no longer a fierce storm. It was cold, deep, and sharp as steel, because now he understood that the problem wasn't in a greeting or a glance, but in permission. Someone at a very high level had legitimized prejudice, turned subjectivity into procedure, and transformed employees into silent human filters. The major twist of this section: this wasn't a training error, not an old procedure, but a new culture that had been installed silently by the very people being rewarded for performance. Daniel wrote the last line for that night in his notebook: "No more doubt. This is a system of discrimination based on favorable image, designed, operated, and tacitly legalized. It's time not just to document, but to confront." Dawn cast a pale yellow light over the Los Angeles skyline as Daniel closed the suitcase that had been his companion for the past 14 days. The frayed backpack, the old sneakers, the shirt, faded from being hastily washed in roadside hotels. He packed them away neatly, like a farewell ritual to the identity of Greg Miller. That evening, in his Chicago penthouse apartment with a direct view of the East River, the warm yellow light softly illuminated the large mirror in his dressing room. Daniel stood before the mirror. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. The salt and pepper stubble was gone. His face was now clean-shaven, a crisp white shirt, ironed to every seam, a dark blue vest that fit him perfectly, a silk tie in a deep blue, the symbolic color of Aerolux, tied in a tight and precise Windsor knot. Italian leather Oxford shoes, so polished they reflected the ceiling lights, were worn for the first time after 2 weeks of only wearing sneakers. Daniel looked up into the mirror, not to admire, but to calibrate his identity. He wasn't dressing up as the CEO again. He was the CEO, and this time he was walking into headquarters not just with his title, but with a story in his hands, evidence in his pocket, and ready to confront a machine that had derailed from the track of justice. The next morning, Aerolux Air Headquarters, 40th floor. No one greeted him as usual. It wasn't because they realized he had just returned from an Aspen training retreat. It was because his gaze silenced the entire hallway. Cold, still, and precise. Not an extra word, not a polite smile. Claire was already waiting in his office. She didn't ask anything, just silently pushed towards him a personnel file, a list of involved employees, a laptop already connected to the main conference room's projection system, and a whisper: "The meeting is at 11. Legal is ready. HR has been alerted. No one knows the details except you and me, except..." Daniel gave a slight nod, took off his coat, and flipped to the first page of the file. Sarah Jennings, Atlanta Lounge. Kevin Rowe, LAX Controller. Diane Walker, Denver Flight Attendant. Every name was linked to documented instances of deliberate, selective priority. And, at the very top, Thomas Reed, regional director, the man who had turned brand-aligned presentation into an unspoken criterion in all the hubs he managed. Daniel said nothing, but his jaw tightened for just a second, enough for Claire to understand it was time. A silent and chilling twist. Daniel had once been called a humane leader by the press. But in this moment, he didn't project the image of an inspirational speaker. He was the man about to take a scalpel to the very system he had built, to cut out the cancerous growth he had once turned a blind eye to. And this time, he wouldn't wait another minute. 11 a.m. The 42nd floor conference room, a place that had hosted million-dollar signings, was packed today. 12 board members, including investors, legal counsel, and former airline executives, were murmuring among themselves. The large LED screen was on and ready. No one knew what Daniel was about to present, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Then the door opened. Daniel Ford walked in. White shirt, blue tie, no assistant, carrying only a laptop and a worn black notebook. No one said hello. He didn't smile either. "Thank you all for being here," Daniel began, his voice low but clear. "What I am presenting today is not a report. It is not speculation. It is evidence, and it demands immediate action." A click of the mouse. The screen lit up. It wasn't a chart. It was a clip from the security camera at the Atlanta lounge, where Sarah had refused to serve Daniel because he didn't look like a first-class passenger. Next came the internal email between Diane and Thomas Reed. Then, the internal system log. Daniel's name flagged with an X3 code, requires re-verification during peak hours. All whispers ceased. I, your CEO, was discriminated against at 4 airports in 14 days, simply because I wasn't wearing a vest or an expensive watch. Daniel said slowly, "And if it happened to me, it has happened to thousands of customers we know nothing about." A board member raised his hand. "I understand the frustration, but this is still just a single experience, not representative of the entire system." Daniel didn't let him finish. "Then how do you explain the 127 manually flagged cases in the last 6 months, of which 92% were passengers not wearing designer brands, makeup, or who were dressed casually? This isn't a feeling. These are statistics, and that system was approved by people sitting in this very room." The silence was so profound you could count the seconds. Daniel lowered the screen. He pulled out the black notebook. "I wasn't the CEO that day. I was Greg Miller, the man who was denied, looked down upon, and re-verified, because he didn't look high class." The decisive moment, Daniel listed 4 actions that would be implemented immediately. The immediate suspension of all involved personnel, including Sarah Jennings, Kevin Rowe, and Diane Walker. The termination of manual flagging privileges at gates and lounges. No more discrimination based on subjective feelings. The establishment of a customer council, a group of real passengers with the power to provide direct input on service procedures. A mandatory requirement for every senior executive to work on the front lines for at least 2 days each year. The CFO, sitting at the head of the table, spoke up slowly. "These reforms will cost a lot of money." Daniel replied instantly, "Not as much as the cost of a class action lawsuit, or the price we'll pay when customers find out that this airline only respects people who look the part." The board voted, 10 in favor, 2 were silent. That very afternoon, 17 employees were suspended or terminated. Among them, 5 were senior managers. And the first person to be called into a private internal meeting was Thomas Reed. 9 a.m. The next day, in Aerolux Air's internal broadcast studio, the ceiling-mounted camera blinked red once and then lit up. Tens of thousands of employees, from the premium lounges to the baggage carousels, received a notification. All work is to be paused for 15 minutes to watch a message from the Chief Executive Officer. In the terminals, flights were held at the gates. In corporate offices, employees stopped their meetings. In maintenance hangars, the sound of machinery fell silent. All eyes turned to the screens, and then the image of Daniel Ford appeared. There was no splendid backdrop, no honor boards or slogans, just him in a white shirt, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, standing against a dark background. His face didn't hide his exhaustion, but his eyes were more alert than ever. He began without a script. Many of you know me as the founder of Aerolux, but few know that I started with a folding table, 2 roots, and a promise. He paused, took a deep breath, that if I ever had the chance to build an airline, I would build a place where every passenger is respected, not for their title, not for their watch, not for their designer bag, but because they are real people with real stories in the middle of a real journey. He looked directly into the camera, as if looking at each person through the screen. 2 weeks ago, I gave up my position as CEO. I became passenger Greg Miller. No name, no power, no privileges. And I saw clearly what the charts could not say, that we, in silence, have slowly learned to decide who deserves kindness based on their appearance. No one in the system said a word, but many bowed their heads. Daniel continued, his voice softer, but more powerful than any shout. "We don't call it discrimination. We call it a prioritized experience. But when an old woman is ignored because she's wearing an old sweater, when a loyal customer is doubted because he's not wearing leather shoes, when a father is pushed out of the upgrade line because he isn't carrying a laptop bag, then that is no longer service. That is judgment. And I am the last person who should have let that happen." The entire system was dead silent, and then his tone changed, warm, firm. "As of yesterday, 17 people have been suspended for violating our core values. We have eliminated manual flagging privileges. We have established a customer council to hear directly from our passengers. And I, along with all senior leaders, will return to work on the front lines every year." Daniel bowed his head for a moment, an unspoken apology. Then he looked back at the camera, this time for a final message. "When I was 19, I was stranded overnight at an airport with the last $3 in my pocket. When I asked for help, The employee looked me up and down and replied, "You'll figure it out." That night, I lay between 2 rows of plastic chairs, watching others get their names called, board their planes, and disappear. I promised myself, if I ever built something, I would never let anyone be left behind like I was. Today, I keep that promise. The camera slowly faded. The screen went black. The Aerolux logo appeared with a new tagline, seen for the first time: every passenger, every time. 3 days after the speech. The 38th floor of Aerolux headquarters, the CEO's office, was unusually quiet. No more hurried footsteps, no secretaries coming in and out, just the golden sunlight slanting through the glass windows, and a guest sitting in a chair, waiting. Marcus Evans, the man with the worn-heeled shoes, the canvas bag, and the look in his eyes that Daniel would never forget. I just want to be respected, even when I'm not wearing a vest. Marcus didn't know the reason for the meeting. He had only been invited with a single-line email: "I owe you a meeting." Daniel Ford. When Daniel entered the room, there were no cameras, no reporters, just 2 men, a desk, and a shared memory. Daniel sat down. No vest, no tie. "I want to thank you, Marcus," he began. "That day, you could have stayed silent, but you chose to speak. And because of that, I saw my own company." Marcus shrugged, half smiling, half pensive. "I didn't think you'd pay any attention. When people like me talk, usually no one listens." Daniel looked at him, slowly pulling 2 things from a drawer. The first was 2 first-class tickets to anywhere Aerolux flies. "This isn't to make amends. It's an invitation. Go somewhere you've never dared to fly, simply because you felt you didn't belong." Marcus looked at the tickets and smiled, but he said nothing. Daniel placed the second item on the table, a letter of appointment. To the position of advisory member on the Aerolux Customer Council. "We want real people. People who have been ignored. We need you at this table to remind us that the feeling of being disrespected doesn't show up on a chart." Marcus fell silent. After a moment, he said softly, "I accept, but on one condition." Daniel tilted his head slightly. Marcus looked at him directly. "Never let this be forgotten. Don't let the promise become just a slogan." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with a deep gratitude. "I won't forget, and I won't let anyone else forget." The 2 men stood up and shook hands like 2 teammates, not because of titles, not because of status, but because they had stood at opposite ends of a system that needed fixing, and had both decided to act. The final quiet twist. As Marcus left the office, he walked down the hallway where photos of the top performers of the quarter used to hang, all of them employees in suits and ties. But that morning, in the center position, a new plaque was hung, the one who reminded us not to forget Marcus Evans. That weekend, Daniel returned to the airport unannounced, without an entourage, without media. He stood in a very familiar spot next to gate C14, where 10 days earlier he had been turned away from the lounge. But this time, something had changed. An elderly couple, wearing old sweaters and carrying a scuffed suitcase, approached the check-in desk. The young man at the counter, wearing the same uniform as Sarah once did, smiled. "Good morning. Let me check on an upgrade for you both. And if you need, I can push your suitcase for you." Daniel didn't intervene. He just stood still, hands in his pockets, his eyes slightly moist, not because it was a grand scene, but because it was a small, right thing. No diamond card, no name on a VIP list, but they had been seen, and they were respected. Daniel turned to leave. He didn't need to go into the lounge. He had seen the most important thing, a system learning how to be human again. That afternoon, he returned to his office and opened the black notebook, the one that had been with him through 14 days, more than 10 cities, and nearly 200 notes. Turning to the very last page, he wrote, "Respect isn't an added service. Respect is the flight. And every passenger, every time, deserves to take off with dignity." He closed the notebook, put it away in a drawer, never to open it again, not because everything was perfect, but because from now on, the change was no longer in the notes. It was in every glance, every smile, every kind decision, happening every day, by people who once thought it didn't matter. At a small airport in Oregon, a trainee flight attendant had just helped a disabled woman get into her seat. When the passenger thanked her profusely, she simply smiled and said, "I'm just doing the right thing. Everyone does now." At a maintenance station, a mechanic in an oil-stained shirt looked at a new notice posted in the brake area. No one is judged by their appearance. Everyone has value. And somewhere, in a first-class lounge, a young employee stood up and invited a passenger in old khaki pants inside. To the surprised looks of those waiting in line behind him, the passenger smiled softly and said, "Thank you. I've never been welcomed like this before." Because real change doesn't come from a boardroom. It comes from every single person deciding to see others with fair eyes. You may not be a CEO. You may not be in charge of an airline, but every day you have the power to choose what the biggest systems sometimes forget. To see other people, not with your eyes, but with respect. Because sometimes what breaks a person isn't failure. It's the feeling of never having been seen at all.